Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Okay, I'm back already, trying a new experiment with sound. This video, I'm not going to reshoot if it doesn't come out right, just warning you now. So, I don't know how the audio settings are. Instead of using the webcam microphone, which is quite a distance away, which is why the sound isn't that great on the videos, because the webcam is up on top of the computer monitor, and it's quite a hunk of distance away. So I think that's why, I don't have a lot of clarity with audio or volume. So I'm trying a little experiment here with my mixing board and with one of my recording microphones plugged into the mixing board. But I didn't spend a whole lot of time setting it up, to be honest. And I don't know if the volume is actually going to be any louder, because I have it turned up all the way. I don't know if the volume is actually going to be any louder than my standard regular video or not. So it's kind of a work in progress. But I notice, I know Carm records on an old-fashioned camcorder that has just the most incredible mic, so it picks up his vocals, his voice really well, but it's incredible how well it picks up the background music as well, in terms of clarity. So it's a damn good mic that's built into that old camcorder. So I know this is a real basic setup with my mixing board, my Roland that I used to record my music on, my Roland hard disk, which is all full of stuff. This is an attempt, what can I tell you? So I'm not going to make you suffer through me talking again about another chapter of my easy listening enjoyment music. I will do a follow-up on that. And again, I'm really not prepared. I just wanted to do a video to get into a rhythm of doing at least, while I can, at least a couple videos a week, 2 or 3 a week, or like maybe like 5 every 2 weeks or something, on a semi-regular basis. So this may not be of any interest to most of the folks, that the few that watch my videos. What I was thinking of talking about a couple weeks ago, and I didn't get around to it, and I'm still not 100% sure that people really want to hear about it, though, is a little bit of my personal musical history. A lot of that is kind of revealed when I talk about the albums that I loved and that opened up new vistas for me and new worlds. Because when I was in high school, I was just interested in rock music, and it kind of progressed, and probably the same for a lot of people, and especially because this was the mid-'70s, so prog rock was really blooming and flourishing at that time. So when a person was ready to get into more sophisticated music, or more involved music, that was the first step. So I got into the prog thing, and first the mainstream bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who are really only like one album of theirs, and Yes, but I mean the real creative peak of them, though, because it was happening at that period. So the Close to the Edge and the Tales from Topographic Oceans and the Relayer, those 3 albums specifically. And I gotta admit, all 3 of them were over my head when I first started listening to them. Especially Tales from Topographic Oceans. Plus, it's a 2-record set, so it's twice as much music on there, and each track is a full side of the album. And sometimes my attention was a little bit. I could listen to. I used to listen to like a hard rock, heavy metal band's jam, but that was, I guess, different in a way. It wasn't maybe the song lengths, but it was more like the more complex things going on, and a lot of changes in terms of rhythms and parts that are more written out than jamming, and maybe a little more sophisticated musically. That took me a few listens initially to really appreciate. Kind of like classical music is now, when there's so much going on and it changes so fast that you really have to, one, pay attention, and two, maybe get familiar with certain parts of it so that certain sections you kind of memorize, or they sound familiar when they come in and you kind of wait for them. And then as you listen to the piece repeatedly, you get familiar with larger percentages of the overall composition, so you know what's coming up, and you can listen for the changes and kind of anticipate them and where they're going and what changes, and like in classical music, what the horns are doing versus what the strings are doing, that kind of thing. You're not going to get all that on one listen. So going from the prog rock thing, which also kind of started to die out really just as I was getting into it for a couple of years, and those bands started making more commercial albums because the whole disco thing started happening, and all of a sudden the radio stations were divided. Instead of having a zillion rock stations, you had rock stations and disco stations. So the rock things became more competitive maybe for airplay and airtime. So bands stopped making 20-minute pieces, or at least exclusively 20-minute pieces, or even long pieces, vying for that radio play. And then even the rock bands started putting disco beats in their songs and getting airplay for doing that. So it was pushing the more obscure prog guys way into the background, and not to the point that they didn't get played on radio. And this was just as I was beginning to appreciate it. So I got disappointed in these guys that I thought were good musicians, and I thought they were above kind of selling out and going commercial. And that's what drove me to start exploring a little bit. Now, this is late 70s, so at that time you couldn't sample anything before you bought it. Nothing was online. There weren't a million radio stations, no satellite radio or anything like that. So you did a lot of buys that were either blind buys or recommendations from people that you knew. At that time, the people that worked in record stores were kind of a wealth of knowledge, and they were, most of the employees at the large record stores were well versed in some form of music. You had a guy that was familiar with jazz, a guy that knew classical, and somebody that knew maybe the more obscure rock, and the guy that was the import guy. And I started dabbling. I knew loosely a couple people in the biggest store that I used to shop at, the one that had also not only the biggest selection in terms of everything, but the bigger selection in imports. So, when I was looking for things like, well, gee, they're not making records like Tales from Topographic Oceans anymore all of a sudden. And so there were things there, or people could have recommended things like Gong, like You or Angel's Egg in that period, because that was just coming out, that stuff. And eventually, of course, from flipping through all those records, I started seeing a lot of things that I would be into in the future, and some bands to this day that I've only heard of, or I've just in the last year or so, like Griffin, been able to finally sample online and go to YouTube, and gee, I never did pick up an album by this group. Let me check out what they sound like. So I started doing a bit of buying of like maybe a Gentle Giant album, like I said, or Gong, or there was a group, I think it's French, called Ange, that a lot of people knew, that sing in French. And Pulsar, who was very much, I don't know, maybe a little Pink Floyd-ish. And even a bit later, Camel. And the first album that I picked up of Camel, though, was 1981. And I was kind of already almost out of that stuff. I don't know what made me pick it up then, but an album called Nude, which struck me as sounding very much like Pink Floyd. In fact, from the albums of theirs that I've heard, and I have a handful, including ones that are entirely instrumental, to me, that Nude album still sounds the most like a Pink Floyd, Wish You Were Here period Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon kind of thing. I think Pink Floyd fans would like that, though I actually haven't heard it for years. It's probably up on YouTube. So I was kind of experimenting and pushing the limit because the more well-known prog bands had started going commercial. So I started picking up older albums too. Instead of buying everything that was fairly new releases, I was going back just, maybe 5 years or so, buying things that had come out. It seems like 1973 in particular was a really good year for prog music. It was still new, and bands were they still had a lot of area that they could experiment in, and they could do it and somehow sell records even without airplay. I bought things like Renaissance, the early Renaissance albums, which are really good. But that was kind of a condensed period because I also at that time, through that period, picked up my first Klaus Schulze album, which was Time Wind, and that was incredibly influential. I had been looking at his albums with the covers, and at that time he had his first 9 albums were out. The X album hadn't come out yet. By the time X came out, I was a fan of his already, and I knew what he did. So I would see albums like Time Wind and Mirage specifically, which might have been the first 2 I picked up. I know Time Wind was the first one. But Time Wind was a bit of a life changer because it was that thing that I came to love more than anything else, the all-solo album. Everything on here is played by one musician, overdubbed in the studio kind of setting. So not only was the music really cool, two pieces that were almost 30 minutes in length, so you really had time to sit there and absorb, but there was no vocals, there was no drums. It was purely instrumental, and that really hit me. And it also made me see that there's, say, other forms of music. It's not really different in terms of chord structure and music than the prog rock stuff. But because it was entirely instrumental, and it wasn't drum beat heavy, and there was no kind of, the first couple albums I picked up by him didn't have drums, didn't have wild rock soloing over it, basically were all keyboards. It was like you were in a different world. Both of the albums, probably the first 3 or 4 albums I picked up, all had sidelong compositions. Like I said, no drums, no vocals. And so it made me begin to see music in a different, as being much more open and creative than I thought it could be, or than I realized it could be. Now, I was aware that classical music existed in jazz and all that stuff, and it's weird though. In my mind, I just dismissed it. I don't know why. Not that I didn't. It's not like, oh, I won't listen to that. It's just that it just never came to the forefront for me yet as something to listen to, and I don't know why that is, or if I had a very maybe narrow view of what jazz encompassed and what classical music encompassed. Now, growing up when I did, I was growing up in the 1960s and watching a lot of television. All the TV shows had, especially the 60s, a lot of jazzy soundtrack music going on, because at that time in the late 60s, rock and roll music took over, jazz lost its mainstream popularity, and a lot of the jazz musicians, especially the West Coast guys, stopped trying to make a go at having a name solo career and went into the studios and became studio musicians, which included the writing of the various TV and music themes. So if you look at soundtrack music, whether it's movies or TV shows, from the 60s and 70s, you're talking about a whole lot of jazz musicians, talking about American stuff anyway, a whole lot of jazz musicians writing this stuff and playing it and creating it. But that stuff was, it's weird. I was aware that it was there, but I wasn't actively honing in on the music, like the way most people watch TV that aren't, say, music fans. They watch TV and the music's there, and it kind of is just a part of the stew. It's just there to enhance maybe what's going on the screen, but not something that they focus in on. And I guess it was the same for me, because I can remember watching any movie, old movies, but in the late 60s, especially on the independent TV stations that aired horror movies, they were playing a lot of horror movies from the early 1930s when sound first started getting into movies. And pretty much all horror movies from the 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, used kind of like a classical music setup. A lot of orchestral music, a lot of oboes and things like that. That music I was slightly more aware of, but I don't know how conscious of it I was, because I could pick out the themes, but I didn't necessarily just focus and think of the music. But I was aware of how the music was setting up various scenes and things like that, especially in old black and white horror movies, when there's not something horrific actually happening on the screen, but rather to set the stage for an atmosphere or something creepy, or seeing a house from the outside of the house at night. You don't see anything horrible going on, but if you put the right music in there, it kind of suggests an eeriness or something. And I was kind of aware of that, because I see a lot of these, especially the Universal horror movies, which recycle a lot of the same themes and the same recordings of pieces written for the movies. And the actual films themselves were repeated fairly often. So the cycle of music was almost constantly there. Because I'm aware now when I watch these movies that Universal was using a lot of the same exact recordings and themes in a lot of different horror movies through the years. They didn't write a separate score for each one of their movies. But it also made me begin to maybe hone in and pick up on the music a little bit more. So around 78, I'm playing music, kind of thinking of what to do in 77, 78, and I wanted to do some kind of prog rock thing. And I had two friends from high school. I didn't really start playing at all, really, until right after I graduated high school. But I had these two guys that I kept in touch with, and one of them was a drummer who also played marimba, who came... Now the marimba, I didn't know anything about, had no use for me in terms of a rock context. It figures in later on down the road for me. So I had a good friend, Bob, who I think he lives in Ohio now. And he was a drummer. And I should have listened a little bit more closely to him, because I think through his dad, his dad was a big music fan. I believe his dad was a big fan of the stuff of his era, which was the big bands. But I guess through him, Bob got to know a lot of this big band music, and knew, I think, guys like Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich and all those guys. And I wasn't paying any attention to those guys yet at the time, even though I did see Buddy Rich on The Tonight Show on occasion at that time in the 70s. So I had Bob, and I had my good buddy Frank, who was the guy that was the closest partner musically that kind of stayed through all the various changes. I mean, we started playing. Actually, he was playing in a cover band, in a rock cover band, and tried to get me into it, but I wasn't good enough, I guess, like as a rhythm guitarist or something initially. But I kind of lost interest in that very quickly, and I got into prog, and then I was kind of wanting to play in that style a little bit, and the two of us would jam. He was a bass player primarily. And we would jam, but at that time it seemed like my taste changed weekly. It seems like I went from the progressive rock thing to the all-instrumental rock thing, wanting to form a band kind of like a Mahavishnu Orchestra thing, even though I hadn't heard Mahavishnu Orchestra yet at the time. And then going from that to wanting to do a kind of Klaus Schulze thing. And this was all in a period of probably a year or less than a year. It goes to show how sometimes when something sparks you, how fast changes, and youth too, and how fast changes can affect you, and you would adapt to them, especially, like I said, especially when you're young. And when I heard that Klaus Schulze thing, it was really the first time that I stopped listening to music and thinking in terms of a band, you know, a 3 or 4 piece band, and rather just this kind of music that doesn't try to sound like a band. You know, whether it's and it's not because it's not a full sound, but on those classic Klaus Schulze albums and even the Tangerine Dream, they're not necessarily always, or a big chunk of the time, trying to sound like a band with drums and bass players and guitars. A lot of times they just revel in the keyboard sounds. So it's not like one guy or 3 guys trying to sound just like a rock band. It was something else. The music was conveying something else, and it wasn't so stuck on heavy rhythm or a repeating bass riff for somebody to solo over. And that's, I guess, one of the things that really hit me. And so I went from prog to wanting to do this kind of instrumental prog thingy, to then wanting to do this kind of electronic thing. And back then synthesizers were really expensive, and most of them were monophonic, and if you wanted a different keyboard sound, you had to buy another keyboard. The only keyboard that I bought at that time, and it was used, and I spent probably 3 weeks' salary on it or more, was something called a string ensemble, which I picked over a monophonic synthesizer only for a couple of reasons. The monophonic synthesizers were very expensive, but they only got one note, one sound. And even those didn't have a lot of preset sounds. So I went for the string ensemble because it was one of the few polyphonic keyboards, electric keyboards. And there was a used one at the music store because they were very expensive. And I could play chords on it. And I liked the string sound. And it's funny, because I had one of those, and I don't even remember now what make or model it was, but the companies that made them, there was probably a few, basically all had the same sound to them. And you have to remember, this is a keyboard that only had one sound. There was no buttons on there to change the sound. That was it. It was the string ensemble sound. But the nice thing about it was the sound itself and the fact that you could play chords on it. And by playing chords on it, you could create this nice bed to put something over, like guitar or something like that. So even without maybe percussion going on, and I was still kind of somewhere between the prog rock mentality and the Mahavishnu kind of thing and the Klaus Schulze thing. So I was thinking of this string ensemble as maybe being something I could put down some chords on the keyboard, play some guitar over it. Frank would play bass along with it, and depending on the period we were in, I may or may not need drums, because there was a period when I didn't want any drums in my music at all, and it was during this period. I don't know why, I got very anti-drum at one point, and I stayed that way for over a year or so, actually until I went acoustic. And then I started seeing the benefit of having like hand percussion, not drum kits so much, but hand percussion, playing along in the context of what I was doing. And through all of this period, and I'm going through all these changes very quick depending on what record I bought this week, and it seems like all the records I picked up, maybe I'm forgetting the ones that didn't do it for me, didn't work for me, but it seems like at that period, during this kind of golden period, I was picking up a lot of albums, and every single one of them would be very influential, not just conceptually as to what music could be, but also in terms of instrumentation and sound and what to go for and how not to necessarily try to sound like a band with a rhythm section and, you know, and a lead player, the kind of thing you're used to hearing. I'm dragging Frank along with me, and I think there were times when he would scratch his head because he was already coupled, so he had more of a domestic life than I did. He had a girlfriend that he later married. So he didn't have, when he was away from his day job, he didn't have all the free time that I had. Apart from my day job, it was nothing but free time. And it was all spent buying music and listening to music for the most part. In his case, he had a little bit more of a domestic situation going on. So he was more divided and didn't necessarily have the same amount of time to go through all these music discoveries as I did. And like I said, I was changing really fast from what I wanted to do. And I was always kind of like, you got to listen to this, or you know what, how about if we change and we stop using drums and we don't do this? And he was always there. He was always like, okay, you know, he was always game to try something. And there's only a couple instances when I did some really big drastic changes, like literally overnight, that he wasn't completely with me. That took him some time to get it. But by the time he started to maybe come around with some of these changes, I had moved on to something else, or starting to incorporate other elements, and those other elements maybe he liked better. So it was okay. I might not dig this thing, but you're bringing in these elements, and you still got some of the old elements of the stuff that I did like. And the changes, and you know, I really wish that video cameras and the like had been as affordable and available and portable as they are now. You know, to keep a diary. Because I think it would have been incredible to take a period from like, say, the beginning of 1978 into 1980. Well, I would like all the way to have from like 1978 to 1983. It was about 83 that Frank and I stopped playing together. But all the changes we went through, especially from 78 to 81, or yeah, probably about 81. Finally, in the last couple years that we played together, we had stopped changing every month and settled into an acoustic thing, believe it or not, an all acoustic thing, because at that point I had got into jazz, and I got into ECM records, and I got into Oregon, especially the band Oregon, which was all acoustic, multi-instrumentalists. And that was another big change. I mean, imagine in the course of 2 years, going from wanting to play all electronic music like Klaus Schulze to going to all acoustic music like Oregon. And we even recorded some demos, which I actually I have the master tapes on reel, but I would have to go to a professional studio to transfer them. But I have some demos of things that we did during that period. The best thing, though, in the early I'm into Klaus Schulze period, unfortunately, was a live performance of a 38-minute piece that I wrote that we rehearsed in bits and sections and only played live once the whole 38-minute piece through from beginning to end as a trio. with me on guitars and my string synthesizers, playing electric guitar, a couple sundry instruments here and there. Frank was playing electric bass, he did some vocal things, and my old friend Robert, the drummer, was playing marimba at that time. And that was a really cool combination. The marimba with the synthesizer and the bass in there. You don't really need the electric guitar, but I mean, I was playing it then. But I still think that's kind of a neat combination. That would be a neat combination to do something with. The marimba being a very warm, acoustic sounding instrument. So anyway, I'm going through all these changes and kind of dragging Frank with me. And as I'm picking up these albums, I'm introducing him to these artists, and then he's going to the record stores and picking up some of these same albums and some different ones, and we're kind of comparing notes. And during this time, of course, with all this going on, there was a very healthy college radio scene that was also going on. And universities and college radio stations were very prominent in New York City, which is the radio stations we picked up, but also northern New Jersey had a bunch. And I would stay up very late at night, especially on weekends, but sometimes during the week as well, even though I was working during the day, to listen to these broadcasts of extremely experimental music. Now, naturally, that got into the mix of what we were playing, too. I got into some really weird stuff that was not musical. It was sound, you know, like I can't think of anybody else to compare it to that people would have heard of, apart from Derek Bailey or the Music Improvisation Company, which had Derek Bailey in it. People like that. Maybe a little bit of the free jazz guys, but they're really out there things where it's more sound than it is music and chord changes. And thinking about it now, especially with the period of how quickly I went through that stuff, and also in that mix was discovering somebody like John Hassell, who the first time I heard his horn sound I thought it was frightening, actually. I was fascinated by it, but I thought it was frightening, which was the Brian Eno album, the album he did with Eno called Fourth World. Pretty out there stuff, especially the second side, which is one big long 20-minute piece. Love it. But when nobody's prepared you for that, nobody told you what it's about. I didn't hear samples online because the computers didn't exist and online didn't exist back then. It came pretty much as a shock. But I got into this experimental music period as well, where we're doing a lot of things with sound, and even recording sound of breaking glass and crazy crap like that. And finding anything you could make sound on. I remember referring to ourselves as sound experimenters back then. Now, I don't know if Frank was just up for it or that he was just game and he said, well, yeah, I'm into it. But at that time, like I said, there's very few times when there was some new direction that I wanted to take on that he didn't like. And that actually didn't even come till later. All these initial stages and romping through all this electronic and experimental and prog and organ-like jazz, ECM-style jazz, he was fine with all that. And it's weird because it was just like, I was always so excited about it, and I would present it to him, say, I got an idea, let's do some, let's do this. I never said it was weird stuff, but during the course of our long jam sessions, I would just start incorporating these things that were more sounds than they were playing. And he was like right there, doing it too, And so I don't know. I don't know what was going through his mind. I often wonder. Maybe it was just he was just totally up for it. But it's kind of weird when you think that a year and a half prior to this period of wild experimentation, the main thing we wanted to do was play in a mainstream rock band. It was just weird, the change that we went through. And I remember one thing, if I had any doubt whether or not he was really into it, which actually I never did, I didn't, but if I had any doubt, this is a long setup for this, I know. One day he brought over a cassette tape, of something that he had recorded at home. Now, at some point, he was working a day job, and he would often stay up late at night and in his own apartment, and he would play bass at home or play with whatever instruments he had at home. And he was a guy that always played a lot, even on his own. And I guess his wife was working at night at that time, briefly. So he would work his day job, come home, his wife would go off to work on certain days. And if we didn't get together to play, which would have been a work night, that meant, he would pretty much always play. And I guess his wife at one point was on a late shift where she would come home somewhere around dawn, so he was home alone all night and in his apartment. He brought me this tape. Hey, I was just doing some improvs at home, and I knew because he's always playing hours. He could play hours a day. Never watched much television. And he brought me this tape. I wish I would have just copied and kept a copy of myself. And you have to remember, back in these days, we were just this is the late 70s. We were just coming out of the era of rotary phones, if you even know what that is. And a lot of people still had rotary phones. And those were phones with a base unit, and you had just the handle. Receiver was just the speaker where you spoke into in the earpiece, and the base part of the phone unit was where you dialed from. And there was this round dial, and you would have to dial 9, and then wait for the dial to return back to its spot, 7, wait for the dial to... It took 2 minutes to dial a number. And the new high-tech thing at the time was touch-tone phones. And so a lot of people got them because you could dial them a lot faster. And initially the touch-tone phones were even built into this base unit just in place of the rotary dial. And then when they got very modern, you started incorporating the whole thing into one piece. And here's the handle, and it's got the buttons in. That didn't come till later. That the part that you spoke into when you listened from also had the numbers on there. But the original touch-tone dial phones, each number had a different tone. So nowadays, when you press the buttons on a phone, if you have one like that, at least on mine, they're all the same tone. It doesn't matter what number I'm pressing. Back then, the numbers were very different tones. So he brings this tape of quote-unquote experimental music that we were into at the time, of him jamming at home late at night. And it starts off with him on his bass, and he's playing some solo bass. And he just left the cassette recorder on. And I don't know, if he had any other instruments there with him, like a small set of bells, or like one of those plastic recorder flutes or something like that too. Yeah, I think he had a couple of things like that around the house. And so I remember hearing something else after he stopped playing the bass. And then all of a sudden, and there's no visual aspect to this, you don't know this is coming. Apparently what he did is he picked up his telephone, held it up to the microphone, and started playing on the phone. And you heard these dial tones, and it was just absolutely hilarious to me. And it just really dawned on me how, at that point, I guess he is into this stuff. Just because we had just gotten into this experimental music phase. And I never stopped to think, is he just kind of going along with me because he thinks I'm insane or something, and he's just placating me? Or is he really into this? But when he brought the tape, I realized that he's into this stuff. And it was just so funny because you had no indication that all of a sudden you were going to hear this dial tone phone going. And this was something that, this is probably 20, 30 minutes, the whole piece that he did. And I just never forget the laugh I got out of that, the whole thing with the touch-tone phone, and wow, it was just it was just one of those moments that kind of said to me, oh yeah, he is into this. He gets it, kind of thing. And I don't know how long we stayed in that phase. You know, it was in terms of months. It certainly was. And that was then at some point we started discovering ECM jazz. First the more electric stuff, and then going more acoustic and getting into that, and started getting away from the deeply experimental stuff and started writing things that were a bit more maybe pastoral in nature, or slightly less experimental. But that's kind of the stuff we stayed with. The last period, which, you know, was something that we did for you know, a year and a half or 2 years, or it was quite a while actually. We got kind of into a more jazz thing and a more acoustic thing. Now I remember at that time, Ralph Towner kind of laid into our period of playing together. Ralph Towner had put out the Blue Sun album, which was a shock to us being Oregon fans and having all these ECM Ralph Towner albums, because Ralph Towner was always an acoustic purist and played only acoustic and classical guitars and piano and flugelhorns and acoustic instruments. And there was no pre-warning that Ralph had picked up a synthesizer and played it, because there was no websites about musicians and their new albums coming out. And all of a sudden, here's this Ralph Towner solo album that just came out that's got him playing synthesizers. And I remember us having some heavy discussions about that. Wow, what do you think of that? He's incorporating electronics into his music. And this was at a period when we had just gotten away from electric instruments totally and completely. Had none at all in our music at the time. And I remember that really having heavy conversations over Blue Sun. We both loved the album, but we were both shocked that somebody that had been an acoustic purist all of a sudden would start using synthesizers in their music so heavily. So that's, again, much longer than I intended to go for. Don't know if that's of any interest. This may serve as a good video to play to get to sleep. But because my number, the story's over, by the way, because of my increasingly dwindling numbers of viewers, I am going to slightly change in future videos my direction in terms of the music that I cover. And I'm going to start off with that direction. I'm sure my old fans will stick with me, because I'm sure they're into this stuff. But it's skewing a little bit more toward popular music. And I'm going to be doing, you know, kind of like things that I'm catching of current music news and updates. And the first two that I have is an announcement that the Spice Girls are going to be touring again, with 4 out of the 5 original girls returning. Only one of them won't be returning, but 80% of the Spice Girls is better than none. So that's good news for all of us Spice Girls fans. And that AC/DC is back in the studio making a new album, and they're bringing back their old singer. So that's really good news. Let's all hope that it's as heavy as all of the preceding AC/DC albums are. And so this is the kind of thing I'm going to be talking about from now on. But I know all you guys love the Spice Girls and AC/DC anyway. So, and you know, next time let's talk about the possibility of Led Zeppelin getting back together again as well. And we'll talk about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and stuff like that. So thanks for watching, everybody. I'm sorry this went on for so long. I really wanted to tell the tale about Frank and his touch-tone phone composition, but I really thought that I had to give the whole musical background as to how we got to that point, and I didn't realize it would take 45 minutes to do that. So anyway, if you watched the whole thing, thanks for watching, and even if you didn't, thanks anyway. And I'll be back very soon, and let's hope that this recording, I don't lose this one when I hit the end record button, but we'll see. Take care, everybody.
Tune in next time for more Tales from the Garage.